one loser. She agreed. But at any rate, Phil, there was a guy said, anybody left that was on the raid that's here today, but Phil told me about it right afterwards. And it was a great story because I'm probably one of the few people that can speak with an accent like Phil's. And as you know, Phil could go out on the range any day of the week and shoot a perfect score. He had which is called a possible, which very few people in the Bureau can do. But he was a great athlete and a great leader like that. And in the FBI manual it says when there's practical use of firearms as a probability, the senior agent or the SAC will take personal charge. Phil always took those words seriously. A lot of the fellows didn't. A lot of the guys would hide under the desk. But those are different kind of SACs. He was always a leader, and that's why people always looked up to him. And as Phil was telling me the story, he said, the guy is running, he said, and I'm shooting at him. And all you can hear is pop, 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 and the guy is still running. He said, and then Ed Tickle was next to me with the shotgun, and you hear boom, whop, and down he goes. And Tickle turned to Phil and said, you gotta lead him just like a deer. Phil said, there weren't any deer in Brooklyn. But Phil was a great, great person. When Phil was transferred to Washington as an inspector, we moved to Washington at the time, and I was with the Pure Land Corporation. And one great story, we all went, we had a company apartment in the Watergate Hotel. So we all met there and went for dinner. It was John Hanlon and his wife and Phil and Iris and Joanne and me. And that happened to be the same weekend that our good friends went into the Watergate. So at any rate, if you remember, most of them were from Florida. And I was from Florida. Most of them were Republicans. And that night when they made the first run was the night we all met at the Watergate apartment and went out to dinner. So after that, Phil, I used to like the kid Phil. I'd say, Phil, Phil was kind of serious. I say, Phil, I hope this doesn't upset you. I was the lookout that night. So, I said, they're all guys from Florida, all the Cuban guys from Florida, McCoy and the different guys. I said, I was the lookout. I hope that won't upset you. And after that, Watergate started to get a little more serious. And he said, knock off that stuff about the lookout. But he was a great man, and he was just a pleasure to know, and a delightful person to have as a friend. And I always remember when Phil, one of the lawyers downtown said to me that Mr. Steinbrenner was looking for somebody as his #1 guy. And there had been a guy there before by the name of Bruce Poston who worked for Mr. Steinbrenner. And he had been knocking down, he'd put Mr. Steinbrenner into a deal, he'd get a little kickback for it or something like that. He put him into that coal deal and oil deal in Ohio, and he was just a sleazebag. So Harvard MBA, this guy lawyer said to me that he's looking for somebody as assistant. And I said, does he have to know a lot about business? And he said, no, he just wants somebody who's 100% loyal. That's Phil McNiff. That was Phil McNiff. And he was a person that was a pleasure to know, a pleasure to have as a friend. And like I said, he was a legend in the FBI and a great guy.
Yeah, thanks. Great stories. Specifically asked Jim to come along because he's one of the best storytellers I know. And most of it's true.
Yeah, is that motel still there? Because I've been going by a couple of years ago, it was still there.
I read in the paper a year or two ago, they're thinking about raising it.
That's right.
But it's a
Boy Scout
historical.
Road there. That's right, on Boy Scout Road.
It was historical black hotel.
All right.
Right on your right, up
Yeah.
where all that St. Pete, water storage, what they call that thing.
Yeah, I just read an article in the paper 2 years ago, they were thinking about raising it, but I don't
When
know.
I last saw it, it was visible. I don't know if somebody's interested, they could drive up
We'll have to get an historical marker put out here. The fellow's name that was killed, the Black Panther, was Fred Fields. Was his name, Fred Fields. Okay, moving on to the next one, then I think maybe after this, we'll take a couple of breaks so everybody can go to the restroom. You gotta drink up that coffee and eat those donuts because I'm not taking them home with me. But I want to talk about a case that I was involved in, Phil, that I got to talk to the press about. I came, as I said, on the same day he did, in January of 1977. Just 3 months later, a case came to fruition that had been developing for a while. We had an informant, the FBI had an informant in Orlando that was an art dealer. And he was approached by some people trying to sell what was purported to be a Van Dyke and some other valuable artworks. And smelled a rat, and he called his handler in Orlando. And then we worked in an agent that was on our squad at the time, a fellow named George Wilson. George is now 84 years old. I invited him to come today. He planned to come, but he has a bad hip and it hurt him too much. He's probably gonna have to get a hip replacement, but he very much wanted to be here, and I wanted him to tell his side of the story because he was actually the one that negotiated the deal. But in that deal, where they worked it out in the end, where we were going, George was going to buy, as an undercover art dealer, he was going to buy the stolen art in a little motel on Treasure Island over by St. Pete. And on the day of the exchange, we brought some cash for show money, and they were supposed to show up with the paintings. Got there ahead of time. Of course, Phil was, again, as already said, every time there was something important going on, Phil was there, unlike maybe some others. And we had set up we had a camper, like a mobile home, and we had a number of agents that were in there. We had parked that in the parking lot. It looked pretty innocuous. We got the manager of the motel to give us some rooms around the one room where everything was going down. We had that one room wired so we could get evidence of the conversation. And at the prearranged moment, they had some discussion. It was recorded, and they went back out to the car to open the trunk and actually take out the paintings. That's when Phil called, gave the signal on the radio, and everybody came out. It looked like the OK Corral. They were coming out from all sides, and there were 3 of them that were involved in the thefts, and they were all standing there in the middle of this. Bob Burrish and all these people standing with shotguns pointed at them. And their first move when Phil yelled out, "Stop, FBI," was that they all turned and reached to their waists, and some of them pulled out guns. And to this day, I can still see it in my mind's eye. I don't know why they all weren't killed on the spot. There was some great discipline shown here. But when they swiveled around and they looked and saw what happened, all of them dropped their guns. Phil yelled for them all to get down. They were searched. They were handcuffed. And at one point, and just to digress here, it was part of the story that I think is an interesting one. Phil pointed to me and another agent, Steve O'Keefe, and he said, "Take this one." It wasn't the one that we had arrested. We had patted ours down and handcuffed him in the back, as you're supposed to do if you're going to transport them. And this was arrested. This individual was arrested by another agent and had cuffed him in the front and put him down on the sidewalk. I should say that by this time, there were a lot of elderly people that were coming out of the motel and surrounding condos, and they were all standing there. And as we cuffed them and we were picking them up, they were all applauding. It was the best show in town that they had, and they wanted it to go on for a while. Well, anyway, when Phil pointed to one person, he said, "Al, you and Steve take him back to the office." So we stood him up. He was cuffed in front, as I said. And Steve O'Keefe, who was a former Green Beret and on our SWAT team and everything, a very experienced and meticulous agent, he said to Phil, has this guy been searched? Because we assumed he was, but we weren't the ones that arrested him. And somebody yelled out, "Yeah, he's clean." But O'Keefe, being the agent that he was, decided, well, I'm going to search him anyway. And I said, "Man, Steve's putting on a show for all these people that are standing around here, and he's patting them down over there, and everybody's watching." And he gets down to his crotch, and Steve starts yelling at the top of his lungs. I go, "Man, Steve's lost it. What's going on here?" Steve pulls open his belt, pulls down his zipper, pulls down his pants, reaches in his underwear, and pulls out a little 9mm gun that he had concealed in his underwear. And of course, at the time, you had a lot going on, and then you have a chance to reflect later on. I was thinking, Steve drove back. I was sitting with this guy in the back seat, and had his handcuffed in the front, which we changed later on, and had access to his gun. And again, you think of the moments when you might not be here to agents looking out for you. In this case, Steve did. Anyway, that was a bit of a digression. So we took these people back, and we recovered guns and masks and bulletproof vests and Halloween masks, everything that they had. I mean, they were clearly bad people, but we didn't know how bad until fingerprinted them and sent some of the guns off to the FBI laboratory where they did ballistics tests on them, and they found out that this group had been involved in home invasions and robberies all up and down the East Coast. Two of them were on parole for murder at Walpole Prison in Massachusetts, and they had shot a state trooper. They didn't know who had done it until the guns came in. They did the ballistics, but they shot a state trooper in the stomach in Delaware who lived. They were involved in a kneecapping of an elderly 70-year-old man. They went into a home invasion. They had a tip that he had a safe in the house, and told his wife to open it, and she wouldn't open it, so they shot him in the kneecaps. And she eventually opened it, terrorized him. So anyway, they matched all this stuff up and put all these cases together. Myself and Ed Krieger, who recently died last year, retired agent, and we spent the better part of the rest of 1978, part of 1979, testifying in trials all up and down the East Coast, Maryland, Delaware, went back to Walpole. There's stories about this in a little packet I put together for everybody later on, and you can review it. But it turned out that the ringleader was a fellow named P.D. Wilson, who was part of some of these big Irish gangs that they had in Boston at the time. And P.D. was interesting in his own right. He's still in jail today as a result. Checked recently, his release date is something like 2028 if he lives that long. But he actually was the person that killed the Boston Strangler. Boston Strangler was a fellow named Albert DeSalvo, and again, many of you are too young to remember it, but it was another case where people were being killed in the Boston, Massachusetts area, murdered women, and they sentenced us before they convicted this guy. Albert DeSalvo was the killer, although there's still a controversy today as to whether he was the person. It's pretty certain he was. But anyway, he and P.D. Wilson, the fellow that we arrested that day in St. Petersburg, they were in jail together in the state pen in Walpole. And DeSalvo was taking a shower, and P.D. walked into the shower. He was the only other person in the shower. When he came out, DeSalvo was dead. And they tried P.D. 3 times, and all 3 times he was acquitted because nobody else would testify, and P.D. wouldn't testify, and the only forensics they had were the shiv that was a handmade shiv. There were no fingerprints because of the shower and everything, and so they had to parole him, and that's why he was out that day. So kind of an interesting case. I mentioned before that, trying to do this chronologically, that Marty couldn't come today, but he asked me, he sent a little note, and he asked me to read this to everybody, a little vignette story that he had involving Phil, and when I'm done, as I said, we took a couple-minute break. But he said in 1978, Special Agent in Charge Phil McNiff summoned me to his office, and he asked if I played handball. I guess knowing Marty was from Brooklyn, that was a given. And I said, I do. He then said, well, how about a game tomorrow morning at the courthouse on Del Mabry at 6 a.m. before we go to work? I was a little stunned at the 6 a.m. time, but how could I say no? So the next morning I went down to the gym, and there he is, already warmed up and ready. Well, for the next hour, he proceeded to engage me in the most aggressive physical combat I'd ever been involved in. During the match, rather than having to call a hinder, if somebody gets in your way, you're allowed to yell that out. He told me he had done that so many times with Phil that he decided not to call him anymore. Instead of calling a hinder, as he was crowding me, I swung at the ball with my left fist for a ball that was coming up the wall with all my might and slammed right into Phil's jaw. Instead of falling down as you would expect, he turned around and looked at me and gave me one of those looks, but never said a word. And I was thinking, what in the world did I just do? We finished up, and prior to departing for the office, Phil wanted to set up another handball game the next day. I bravely told him I was a night person and I could not, and this was after work, and I could not meet him after work. One early morning meeting I missed as I overslept, so that ended the 6 a.m. games. Phil won the gold medal at the Florida Police Olympics on at least 2 occasions for handball while he was the SAC in Tampa. He was aggressive, physical, skilled, and ambidextrous at handball, and I believe that was his favorite sport. But it became difficult to find partners as so many of the young guys were going to racquetball. Only ones left playing handball were some people from New York and a couple of military guys from McGill Air Force Base. And of course, I could not invite my SAC to play down there, as all the other agents would have gone bonkers. See the boss come in while they were all sneaking off to play handball. Phil grew up in St. Thomas Aquinas Parish in Brooklyn at 4th Avenue and 9th Street, which at the time was largely Irish and Italian, and was situated just 4 blocks from the waterfront in Prospect Park. It was a working class neighborhood with very tough guys. I found out years later that the Persico and the Gallo gangs, part of the Profaci and later Colombo families, had clubhouses on 4th Avenue not far from the church, which sponsored the